On October 22, 1962, President John F. Kennedy addressed the American people with unwavering resolve, declaring that the United States would not bow to Soviet nuclear threats in Cuba. His words were clear and uncompromising. America would stand firm against this direct challenge to its security. While Kennedy publicly demanded the unconditional withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba, his administration was secretly negotiating a quid pro quo that would reshape the nuclear landscape of the Cold War. The deal? The United States would quietly remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey in exchange for Soviet withdrawal from Cuba. This secret agreement, known only to 9 U.S. officials at the time, remained hidden from the public for over 25 years. The contrast is striking. In public, Kennedy projected an image of absolute strength and moral clarity. In private, his administration engaged in pragmatic compromise, trading missiles for missiles. This wasn't just a minor diplomatic footnote. It was a masterclass in what diplomats call realpolitik, where practical outcomes trump ideological purity. But this raises a fascinating question. Why do world leaders so often say one thing publicly while doing another privately? Why did Kennedy, known for his idealistic rhetoric about standing up to communism, engage in secret missile trades with the very enemy he denounced? The answer lies in one of the most powerful yet least understood forces in international relations: realpolitik, the politics of reality rather than ideology. It's a framework that has shaped countless historical events, from ancient empires to modern superpowers, yet most people don't recognize it when they see it. The Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't just a standoff between nuclear powers, it was a perfect case study in how realpolitik operates in the real world. While leaders may speak in terms of absolute principles and unwavering positions, the actual conduct of international relations often requires a more nuanced, pragmatic approach, one that prioritizes achievable outcomes over ideological purity. As we'll discover, this pattern of public proclamations versus private dealings isn't unique to the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's a fundamental feature of international relations, one that continues to shape our world today in ways both subtle and profound. To understand realpolitik, we need to travel back to 19th century Prussia, where a master diplomat was about to revolutionize international relations. Otto von Bismarck, a nobleman with an uncanny understanding of power politics, would demonstrate that successful diplomacy often requires saying goodbye to rigid moral principles and hello to flexible pragmatism. In an era dominated by idealistic notions of honor, divine right, and moral absolutes, Bismarck introduced a radically different approach. He famously declared, "Politics is the art of the possible," a simple phrase that would fundamentally reshape how nations interact. This wasn't just clever wordplay, it was a complete rejection of the prevailing diplomatic philosophy that prioritized moral principles over practical outcomes. Bismarck's approach to alliances perfectly illustrated this new philosophy. The degree of his pragmatism was staggering. He maintained a complex web of seemingly contradictory agreements, often making incompatible promises to different powers. The League of Three Emperors, the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary, and the triple alliance with Austria-Hungary and Italy were all part of his diplomatic juggling act. When these alliances no longer served Prussia's interests, Bismarck had no qualms about breaking them and forging new ones. The numbers tell a fascinating story. Approximately 50% of Bismarck's major diplomatic alliances between 1862 and 1890 were later broken for strategic advantages. But here's the surprising part. This apparent diplomatic infidelity wasn't a sign of failure. It was precisely what made his approach so successful. Consider the results. Under Bismarck's leadership, Prussia transformed from a second-tier European power into the dominant force on the continent. Through a series of carefully orchestrated diplomatic maneuvers and limited wars, he achieved what had seemed impossible: the unification of Germany. All this was accomplished not through unwavering loyalty to allies or strict adherence to moral principles, but through a ruthlessly practical approach to international relations. The success of Bismarck's methods forced other powers to confront an uncomfortable truth. In the realm of international relations, pragmatic flexibility often achieves better results than moral rigidity. This wasn't just a 19th century phenomenon. Bismarck's principles of realpolitik would go on to influence diplomacy well into the modern era, shaping everything from Cold War negotiations to contemporary international relations. His legacy teaches us that understanding international politics requires looking beyond what leaders say in public to examine the practical necessities driving their actual decisions. The principles of realpolitik didn't die with Bismarck. They merely evolved. In fact, the gap between public pronouncements and private diplomatic actions has often been widest in modern times, when increased media scrutiny forces leaders to maintain public positions that may differ dramatically from their behind-the-scenes dealings. Before the public announcement, Nixon's administration engaged in an intricate dance of secret diplomacy. Through carefully orchestrated backdoor channels, including the Pakistani government and private intermediaries, Nixon's team conducted at least 7 documented instances of secret diplomatic outreach to China. All this occurred while Nixon publicly maintained a hardline anti-communist stance. The administration was so concerned about secrecy that only a sanitized version of diplomatic transcripts was shared with the State Department. As Nixon himself noted, "Our State Department leaks like a sieve." While publicly maintaining a strict policy against negotiating with terrorists and selling arms to Iran, the administration secretly sold over 1,500 missiles to Iran between 1985 and 1986. The total value of these arms sales reached $47 million, with $3.8 million diverted to support the Nicaraguan Contras, despite explicit congressional prohibitions. This alliance has generated substantial economic benefits for both nations. U.S. companies have invested in over 500 joint projects, valued at approximately $62 billion, while Saudi Arabia has maintained crucial energy supplies to the West. Yet this partnership has required both sides to frequently subordinate stated values to practical interests. Between 2015 and 2024, the gap between declared policy objectives and actual diplomatic actions has become increasingly visible, particularly in conflict zones. For instance, while Western nations publicly denounced Russia's actions in Ukraine, many continued to maintain backdoor diplomatic channels, demonstrating the persistent relevance of realpolitik in modern international relations. This isn't mere hypocrisy, it's a fundamental feature of how international relations actually work. When we examine the most successful diplomatic initiatives of the past 75 years, we consistently find the same pattern: public moral certainty masking private pragmatic compromise. The leaders who have most effectively advanced their nation's interests are often those who best understood this dynamic, even if they couldn't openly acknowledge it. At the heart of modern diplomacy lies a profound ethical dilemma. how do democratic nations reconcile their stated values with the often morally ambiguous requirements of maintaining global power and stability? This tension isn't just an abstract philosophical question. It manifests in real decisions that affect millions of lives. Consider the stark contrast in the Obama administration's approach to international relations. While publicly championing human rights and government transparency, the administration dramatically expanded the use of drone strikes, operating largely outside public scrutiny. This wasn't just a minor policy contradiction. It represented a fundamental tension between democratic ideals and national security imperatives. The numbers tell a sobering story. The measured economic impact of sanctions versus backdoor trade agreements in modern conflict zones between 2015 and 2024 reveals this ethical tightrope. When the U.S. implemented complete trade sanctions, bilateral trade with sanctioned partners decreased by 76%. However, these same sanctions often led to the emergence of backdoor trade agreements that offset up to 50% of their intended impact. Leaders face a complex calculus when making these decisions. The US-Saudi alliance illustrates this perfectly. While this partnership has generated over $62 billion in joint projects and helped maintain global energy stability, it has required overlooking significant human rights concerns. This raises a crucial question. At what point does pragmatic cooperation become moral compromise? The justification for such decisions often follows a consistent pattern. Leaders typically frame realpolitik choices in terms of necessary evils or strategic imperatives. They argue that maintaining global stability sometimes requires working with imperfect partners or taking actions that might appear contradictory to stated values. This creates what political scientists call the stabilizing hypocrisy of international relations, where the gap between public principles and private actions actually helps maintain global order. Perhaps the greatest paradox is that pursuing peace often requires engaging in power politics. Take the recent U.S. military aid to Ukraine. While public announcements promised $183 billion in total aid, actual deliveries have often lagged significantly, with only $86.7 billion dispersed. This gap between public commitments and actual delivery reflects the complex balancing act between supporting allies and managing broader strategic relationships. This ethical balancing act raises uncomfortable questions about democratic governance itself. How can leaders maintain public trust while engaging in necessary but morally ambiguous diplomatic practices? The answer may lie in better educating citizens about the complexities of international relations, rather than pretending these contradictions don't exist. Today's international stage offers a masterclass in how realpolitik operates in the digital age, where old principles meet new realities. The Russia-Ukraine conflict provides perhaps the clearest window into this dynamic, revealing the complex interplay between public posturing and private pragmatism. Consider the stark numbers. While Western nations publicly announced 241 billion euros in aid to Ukraine, only 125 billion was actually allocated, a delivery gap of 116 billion euros. This isn't merely administrative delay. It reflects the careful calibration of support against broader strategic interests. The impact of economic interdependence on modern realpolitik is particularly striking. Despite extensive Western sanctions following its invasion of Ukraine, Russia's economy grew by 3.6% in 2023, surpassing both US and EU growth rates. Russian exports to Brazil, China, India, and Turkey increased by at least 50% after the war began, demonstrating how economic relationships often trump political proclamations. Digital surveillance has transformed how unofficial diplomacy operates. The traditional face-to-face backdoor meetings that characterized Cold War diplomacy have evolved. While exact figures are classified, diplomatic sources indicate that the frequency of unofficial meetings between opposing nations has shifted significantly with the rise of digital surveillance. China's approach to Taiwan exemplifies modern realpolitik in action. While publicly maintaining an increasingly assertive stance, China continues to engage in complex economic relationships with Taiwan's allies. This creates what diplomats call strategic ambiguity, a deliberate gap between public rhetoric and private action that helps maintain stability while advancing long-term objectives. Nuclear deterrence adds another layer to contemporary power politics. The principle hasn't changed since the Cold War, but its application has evolved. Nations must now balance traditional nuclear deterrence with new forms of power projection, including cyber capabilities and economic leverage. The digital age has also introduced new tools for realpolitik. Social media allows leaders to project one message to domestic audiences while pursuing different objectives through private channels. Economic sanctions can be implemented with unprecedented precision, yet their effectiveness is often undermined by digital workarounds and cryptocurrency transactions. What's particularly fascinating is how these modern tools haven't fundamentally changed the principles of realpolitik. They've just made them more complex. Leaders still must balance idealistic public positions with pragmatic private actions. The difference is that they now must do so in an environment where information moves at the speed of light and secrets are harder than ever to keep. This evolution of realpolitik in the digital age teaches us an important lesson. While the tools and techniques may change, the fundamental gap between public proclamations and private diplomatic actions remains a constant feature of international relations. Understanding this dynamic isn't just academic, it's essential for making sense of our current global challenges. The gap between public pronouncements and private diplomatic actions isn't a bug in international relations, it's a feature. From the Cuban Missile Crisis to today's complex geopolitical challenges, realpolitik continues to shape our world in ways that rarely make headlines, but profoundly impact outcomes. The examples we've explored, from Bismarck's pragmatic alliance building to modern economic sanctions that are simultaneously enforced and circumvented, reveal an uncomfortable truth. Effective international relations often require maintaining one position publicly while pursuing different objectives privately. The measured economic impact of sanctions versus backdoor trade agreements in modern conflict zones shows that even the strictest public policies often coexist with pragmatic private arrangements. Perhaps the most important lesson is that understanding this dynamic doesn't mean cynically accepting it, but rather recognizing it as a crucial tool for maintaining global stability. After all, the secret missile trade that helped resolve the Cuban Missile Crisis may have saved millions of lives, even if it contradicted public positions. How might the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis have been different without the secret missile trade with Turkey? Would a purely principled stand, matching public rhetoric, have led to nuclear conflict? In what ways does your country currently practice realpolitik while publicly promoting different values. Consider how national interests sometimes conflict with stated principles in your nation's foreign policy. Can you identify a current international conflict where understanding realpolitik might predict a different outcome than what's publicly discussed? How might private diplomatic channels be working behind the scenes? How does the rise of social media and instant global communication affect the practice of realpolitik in modern diplomacy? Does greater transparency make traditional backdoor diplomacy harder or even more necessary? The answers to these questions might be uncomfortable, but they're essential for understanding how international relations actually work, not just how we wish they worked.